Welcome to the podcast series dedicated to living a revenue culture. Long-term business survival and success is a result of you being able to maximize your profit. And the only way you can do that is by optimizing your people in a low friction culture. And so this podcast is dedicated to helping everybody learn how to do those things. And we do two a month. And we put them out on all the normal podcast locations, and we put them out on YouTube, and they're on our Revenue Game website for anybody who wants to come look at them for probably as long as I'm still in business. So today, our guest is Ron Oltmanns, and when I went to Ron's LinkedIn profile, the very first thing I saw was his mission. And you know I love missions and purpose. And it starts out with to work with 10,000 leaders to grow their leadership impact. He produces a newsletter that's called Mastery and believes that we're all trying to master something. And Ron has recently read my book, Smart Rev, and gave me some just wonderful feedback that we'll get you to hear some of today, but from a different perspective. Ron's passion is in helping us understand and manage and take advantage of our emotional understanding of ourselves. So hopefully we'll get some of that in the conversation today. And two of the areas that he talked about with me the very first time we debriefed on the book was our diffusion of innovation space, Bell Curve 2.0, and how emotion plays into that, which I've always believed, but haven't been very conversant about sharing. So I'm really looking forward to this. And then the other one was our communication model, which is completely intended to create emotions, but I don't ever hear people talk about that much. So I'm really looking forward today. And I just want to say, welcome, Ron. I'm thrilled to have you here.
Thanks, Rick. It's really good to be with you, and I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. So thanks for inviting me.
So again, aside from looking at your mission on LinkedIn, I had to admit I was fascinated by your background. And yes, you've done some interesting things with leadership and training and coaching and enterprise sales, but also your approach to learning. And I'm guessing your approach to learning impacts your approach to coaching or teaching or mentoring other people. So I'd love to have you tell us a little bit about your background and include in that, you've got as many certifications and academic experiences as about anybody I've ever interviewed. And I think it shows in how wonderful your work is. So give us a look at your background.
All right. I'm happy to do that. I, I was one of those kids who actually enjoyed school, and back in the day when we were still reading books, I mean physical books. I think people still do, but it's interesting. My parents, neither one of them went to college, but they really believed in education and they emphasized the importance of it. So what did they do? Um, in the 70s, early 70s, they bought a set of encyclopedias, World Book Encyclopedia. I used to enjoy reading those books, having them open and just, knowledge about the world. And growing up in a small town in New Mexico of 30,000 people or so, my window on the world wasn't terribly large, but through the encyclopedias, I had a much bigger, window on the world. And I will give my folks some credit here. My dad um, worked in the oil industry. I was actually born in Venezuela. And so until I was, 2 or 3, we came back to the States and, plopped down in this small town in New Mexico. But I was able to, get this window into the world that just fascinated me. And I always wanted to learn more about things. And so um, I did well in school. I enjoyed that. And I wanted to really focus on um, a field that would let me just really go deep. And it's interesting because right out of college, I did a bachelor's in 3 years and then finished a master's after another year. And then I went to Southeast Asia and had I parked myself in Singapore for 5 years. And I was in education. I taught there. And after that time, I came back to the US and I was in a university setting and planning. I was on my way to do PhD work until I got sidetracked. I say sidetracked because a mentor that I really appreciated um, pulled me aside and he said, Ron, I see your abilities and your talents. And this is a gentleman who was like, I was in my, late 20s. He was in his uh, late 60s. He had a doctorate in adult education from the University of Southern California, and he was a lifelong learner. And and in the late 90s, he himself was a model of this. He had taken this course with a virtual organization, which we didn't hear of in those days. It was called Coach University. And he said, I think this whole field of coaching, professional coaching has some real, opportunities in it, some possibilities, and you should explore it. But he just kind of left it there, kind of as a suggestion. And they said, and by the way, they have this International Coach Federation and it's meeting down in Houston, Texas, in another month. And if you're interested in looking at the coaching world, that would be a good place to check it out. This is in 97. And I did. I brought my wife Angela along. We checked it out and I said, you know what? I want to pivot. I want to get out of academia because I want to be in a place where people are actually implementing things
Yeah.
versus just studying, and getting into that. And so I took my whole career in a different direction, got certified as a coach, started working with, small business people, and eventually got into the corporate world and enterprise sales, like you mentioned, around 2000 or so. But that's kind of the backstory for me of, I was in the academic world but I wasn't satisfied because there was part of me that enjoyed academia, which is I'm a strong theoretical or intellectual, that's one of my drivers. But there's another driver I have, which is resourceful. I love to implement things and I want to see a return on investment. And I'd see these kids come through the, class, come through university. And I couldn't see the return on the investment. I was very short-term thinking, but that was what was missing. And that's why I decided to get into the business world.
That's very cool because one of the things we believe uh, in the world of revenue science, smart rev, is that purpose matters and that purpose drives all of us at some level. It
Mhm.
sounds like purpose was a deciding factor in your career.
I would agree with that. I'd have to say so. And when you asked me just a moment ago about kind of my approach to learning, I've got to share this. I mean, just last week, I was leading a group of about 25 leaders through a program, and we were talking about pivotal moments in your life or your career, but in your life that kind of where you did a change. And I just mentioned one of those pivots for me. Another one that I would point out is since I had this real emphasis on learning and knowledge, um, I made this decision when I was living in Singapore that I was going to take up a new hobby, something I'd always wanted to do but never had the opportunity, a martial art.
Oh,
And I joined Aikido, this Japanese martial art called Aikido, which is, focused on self-defense and it's a bit like judo, using the opponent's energy,
yeah.
in a creative way against them, but also not it's an ethical martial art. You don't try to damage. It's not about striking or injuring someone, but how do you take someone who's giving you a lot of aggressive energy and diffuse that energy in a positive way, in a creative way that doesn't harm you or them? And so I took up Aikido. But I have to tell you, Rick, the first 3 months of me being in the dojo were painful. Not painful because I was, taking a lot of strikes or, hits or, falls and that sort of thing. That was true as well. But painful because I kept getting feedback from my partners in the dojo, the practice, partners, that I was very tense. I was very, uptight. I was grabbing too hard. I was being, and I was like, they would say, relax. And I was thinking to myself, I am relaxing. And it took me 3 months to realize how much tension I carried in myself and that I needed to actually listen to the feedback and translate that into something, tangible. And this was a huge learning for me because I realized that I was so much in my head that I was totally out of touch with my body. And I would credit Aikido with giving me a whole different window on learning that, when you can not just have a concept in the head, but when you can see a practical result, when you can see the outcomes right there in front of you, you've learned something on a whole different level. And it took me a while. I had a big learning curve in Aikido, but I eventually did get a black belt. In fact, I got a second degree black belt, and I stuck with it for years and years. And it's been really valuable because I realized there's a whole nother channel for learning things versus the traditional knowledge acquisition model. And, there's people who are good at that and who don't do well in school.
Yeah.
And some people can actually do both, and they are bilingual, I'd say, in both ways of learning. So
Would I be correct that when you were stressed in those first 3 months and you couldn't relax, that you were not as able to um, function? You couldn't use the other person's energy as easily when you were stressed. You were blocking the ability to take advantage of their energy.
exactly. You're totally right. I was so tense and I couldn't even tune into it. I wasn't even aware of my own. So I lack self-awareness in the first case. And then second of all, I couldn't tune into to my partner. I didn't have awareness of their energy at all. I mean, even thinking that way, it was like, because Rick, I was so focused on I want to be good at this and I want to do all the moves, and do the things that I see the more advanced people doing. And so I wanted the straight line path to get there. And this is one of the reasons I have my newsletter called Mastery is I came across this guy named George Leonard, who is an American who, learned Aikido as well. And he was from the San Francisco Bay Area. And he wrote the book called Mastery. And since he is an Aikido practitioner himself, he's already passed now, but he talked about how a lot of American culture, we go for kind of quick fixes or
Yeah,
hacks,
right. Yeah.
and this is in the 90s. He was already talking about things like that. But he says on the path to mastery, you have to practice, 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 and kind of make friends with boredom and start picking up on subtleties, and fine tuning the small things. So, of course, you have to get the basics down. But once you know the basics, the whole difference between a master and someone who is a hack is that you actually pay attention to these small, subtle differences that give you huge leverage. And I think the same is true in revenue science. I think the difference between a salesperson or a marketing person who, is very good at their game, they're very competent, and those who are masters
Yeah.
is a pretty subtle difference, but it's huge leverage when you can pick up on these subtleties and apply them well.
In Aikido was when you talk about subtleties, were some or many of those about the other person?
Yeah, so there's a whole, when you enter into any martial art, I would say not just Aikido, any martial art, there's a real focus early on technique. You want to do things a certain way and learn the technique the right way. After you've practiced it hundreds of times, thousands of times, then you start realizing that you can do it more efficiently. And it's not about the technique, but it is about the subtle things like the energy or timing.
Yeah.
A split second makes a huge difference. If you're ahead of the other person or if you're behind the attack, if someone has snuck up behind you and given you a big bear hug, it's like you've got to deal with that in a whole different way than if you perceive them coming and you can just be a split second ahead of them and then you can do something completely different.
Yeah. What's really fascinating to me is when we talk about revenue science, too often people think of revenue science as being sales, and sales is part of it.
Yes.
But the other part is all of these other environmental things. And, in your example of somebody coming up behind you, or even if you were watching them approach you, probably nonverbal communication and a whole series of environmental things help prepare you. And in revenue science, it's the same way. We talk about headquarters out, which is I could be really, really good as a salesperson at pitching you, but if I'm not really in tune with you, it comes across as a crass commercial as opposed to a conversation.
I have been in those shoes of giving the pitch, um, and I've also been pitched. And so being both sides of the table, I know that the times when I was not pitching and I was able to just kind of put that aside and like, let's just have a conversation. Let me try to understand because I obviously, the pitch is whatever I had prepared as the pitch wasn't wasn't what they were looking for, what they needed. And they were kind of shutting down the conversation. So I said, well, let me set that aside. Let me just ask a few questions. And when we did that and we had kind of a meeting of the minds,
Yeah.
it opened up something on a whole different level. And the same thing, people who pitch me, I know the agenda. I can see the agenda. And I find it fun sometimes, Rick, to kind of play with people to say, so um this is a pitch, right? Or you
Yeah.
want to sell me something. And the number of times that people can actually be honest about it is very small. A lot of times they want to deny that it's a pitch or deny that they're trying
Yeah.
to sell me something. And I have a lot more respect for the people who can be upfront and say, yeah, it's a pitch. Yeah, I'm trying to sell you something. Okay, well, bring it on. Let me listen to it. But if they won't be completely honest about it, I just, I'll usually shut it down pretty quick. Like I'm not interested.
That sounds like the 10 solar calls I get here in Phoenix. Everybody wants to put solar on our roof. And they say, oh, no, we're just giving you information. And I'm going, no, you're not.
And it should be pretty easy to sell solar in Arizona, but
Yeah, you think so, but and that's the right answer, Ron, because it should be. But when people come in with such contrived pitches, you're really worried about what's wrong.
right.
When they think they have to manipulate you and they have to, manage the script in this. I sold vacuum cleaners and cookware. I know what those scripts look like. When they have to use a script like they're selling you a vacuum cleaner and they're trying to get you to not be able to back out of it instead of the value of solar in Arizona, which should make a ton of sense. But we can't talk about the value. We have to follow the script. It kind of it creates a anything but a partnership.
Scripts are important for salespeople early on. I mean, like an SDR, sales development rep, just learning the kind of the paces and what the profession is all about. Of course, you need a script, but you don't probably use those on live people
Oh,
except in the office to practice or to get yourself competent or proficient to a certain point. And then you have to discard the script because you realize that this is a big, I was talking with my wife about this just in the last day or two. It was a big aha for me early on in my selling career whenever I realized that the man who was mentoring me, he and I had two different styles. I mean, I should have seen that. It should have been obvious, but again, I'm a little bit slow in some areas. Um, he is a very outgoing, was just a real, what you call a consummate salesperson, a smoozer, sort of
yeah.
like, and he could make friends and strike up conversations with anyone. I'm not that person. I'm much more reserved. I'm much more data driven. That's my approach. And so the more I try to sell like my mentor, it
Yeah.
just it just fell flat. It flopped. I tried to follow the script and I would say exact same words and get totally different results. Not good ones, by the way. And so the day that realized, oh, he has a whole different style. I've got to sell my way, a way that it comes across from my authentic, place and that is representative of my strengths. Well, it's interesting because working in this gentleman's business, I was trying to sell his programs his way. And when I, started doing things my way, we went from having average contracts of five figures, 20 to 30K to six-figure contracts and eventually a seven-figure contract with one customer, which he had never had before in this particular business. And it was like, yeah, once we could get in and see the customer's real needs, and we weren't just selling them what we had, but trying to solve a problem that they actually had, that we had tools, but it was going to take some customization to make it all and the pieces come together. But man, talk about unlocking value for the
Yeah.
customer and for us. And so that was a real learning experience about, okay, we're not just selling stuff. We're trying to solve for a problem, that they have and create something that doesn't even exist right now.
That's such a powerful story, and it the term value, the fact you use the word value, so seldom do people recognize that as a seller, my my success, however little or large, is based on my ability to transfer value to buyers who actually want to pay for it. I can sit there and say, well, this is really wonderful. It's really cool. It's spectacular. But if the person I'm talking to either can't perceive it, can't believe it, or can't achieve it, then there is no value for them. No matter how cool I think it is, there's no value for them. And until I recognize they are the ones who establish what my value's worth, they're often doing that based on how well I communicate to them and understand them so that I can communicate to them. And as I was listening to your story, I was imagining the gentleman you worked for was really good at selling stuff to people who were trying to buy stuff. And you were really much better at helping people who had problems understand new ways to solve problems. Those are really both two different sets of buyers and two different communication models. And most of us don't figure that out in our careers.
It is I've it's a difficult lesson to learn. This particular case, he wasn't selling, so much stuff. It was services. They had to be customized. But his particular approach to it was, it followed a model, and there was a progression, there was a step and a cadence, and that was all fine. That was good. It was coaching, right? And team programs and t getting a team together off site and all that. That was great, but it wasn't that scalable. And he also hadn't figured out the way to unlock like how to impact an entire organization. He thought of it as top down. Like if I, impact the leaders and we can change a mindset, then we can impact the organization. And he was right. The instincts were right there, but he didn't have a revenue model for how to capture that value for himself, for his own company. That was the interesting part. And so there's a whole part that we could talk more about it, which is revenue science helps us to look for customer needs and what is the cost of chaos within the organization, what are they trying to do right now, and what would it you know help them to uncover if they can stop the chaos
Yeah.
or bring some sort of like I said, bring a solution to the table that helps them remove bottlenecks and actually have eye-popping growth, and returns. So I'm thinking of this one particular company. This goes back about 15 years, but they were breaking into a new space, a new technology. And so, on the bell curve, you're looking for those early adopters, and they
Yeah.
were trying to sell something that was really innovative and futuristic. And so they were looking, they were smart enough to realize that they had to find these early adopters. They didn't know how to deploy their sales force, though, who traditionally were still so focused on features and so in love with their technology and just wanted to show up to their own sales calls talking about technology. And part of our work with them was helping them see you've got to get into the customer's mindset and help them solve their problem, and show that sort of connection before you ever talk about your feature set or your technology. So,
Yeah, I'm putting together your early conversation of the first 3 months at the dojo, and and this selling approach. And one of the things that's flashing, and I think I've watched too many Chuck Norris movies or something. But in today's selling world, when you go into, particularly for services, a client, there's typically at least a half a dozen people who have a veto power around whatever you're doing. When you're doing training, it's HR and OD and finance and procurement and compliance and
right.
and then it's the people who actually care about the training. You got to have it, and their motivations are different. Their how they value what you're bringing them differ. And
Mhm.
so I think of the old Chuck Norris movies where it's one guy and like eight opposing ninjas. But in the selling world, that is in effect what we are dealing with today is multiple buyers who are going to have even just a thumbs down opportunity because they say it's not compliant, it doesn't deal with diversity, whatever their issues are, and they can just stop it. So it changes how we need to communicate and how we need to structure value. And you're I love your focus on emotion because those six or seven or eight or nine people are all going to have very different or potentially different emotional responses to different things we say or do.
That's right. And it's interesting when you bring that up, your mental picture isn't far off. Uh, I was talking about it in Aikido, you start as a basic, as a white belt with one partner and you're focused on technique, right? And of course, most all beginners, one of the questions uppermost in our minds is, will this work in the real world? Will this work on the street if I, jump by a guy or whatever? So it's interesting, by the time I did my black belt test, you do demonstrate techniques, but there's also a big part of that where it's called freestyle, where you have multiple attackers who come at you and they can come from all different directions and simultaneously. And how do you deal with that? How do you address, that sort of situation where you've got not just one person to focus
Uh,
on, but multiple different ones. And that is like in enterprise sales specifically, that's something that is a reality that you've just described. And even if you're not selling enterprise, even like let's say mid markets or
yeah,
a complex sell, you've got multiple decision makers. Now, not all of them have ultimate buying authority,
right,
but they have input. And you said veto, they are able to basically put up the X, the red X. It's
yeah,
like, America's Got Talent. It's like they can vote you out
yeah,
or say, no, not compliant, doesn't work for us. And you can't just, kind of wave them aside like a Jedi
yeah,
and dismiss them. That doesn't work. And so the question comes back to value. So you got to do your homework for one thing, but also really be listening on different levels and understand what people care about. Okay, finance person, you expect that they care about obviously the numbers and the financial, modeling and all that. But it is a grave mistake to think that that's all they care about, or that that's the only, like, okay, they're a potential blocker, right? And it's going to come in terms of finance. It was a big learning for me. The CFO can actually be your partner,
Yep.
right? And they might actually be a person who really cares about the aesthetics, you know, and you didn't see that one coming if you're not, open or paying attention. If your mental model is like every person is there only to serve their role versus coming as a full human being with their emotions, with their interests, with, the whole gamut of things. And so, and don't dismiss the admin assistant who's taking
Oh,
notes or treat them as if they're unimportant. They may be the linchpin to the whole deal that you didn't realize because all these smart, people with big titles and, powerful things, it's like nothing happens if it doesn't get coordinated and put on the calendar and managed by the assistant. And the assistant has tremendous power sometimes that you don't even realize. Informal authority, we would say. So,
yeah, and it's interesting, and this is really we're in that part of the book on the message model and the emotional responses where we're trying to get across, which really demonstrate whether people heard what we said and then valued it, or didn't hear it and can't value it, or heard it and don't value it, because they will respond differently, both internally and then in their communication. And the other piece for this that's so critical to the emotional part is how did we even get in the room? And we all wonder about, well, where do I get my leads from? And, of course, having a lead is important. Having the right lead for the right reasons is even more important. And when you have achieved, hopefully, the right lead for the right reasons, there's some amount of expectation that's already been set just to be able to make that statement. And, whether they heard you speak at a conference or a referral or whatever, it's that understanding, and it's a little different than the person sneaking up behind you, but not a lot. What do they understand before we actually get started? Because if they understand, let's say the things that add value, the conversation is going to proceed in one direction. When they misunderstand, we have to go back and reset expectations for all of the people in this mission before we get to go forward.
right.
And, so I think that's, where marketing and brand and other things that people say, well, that's not to deal with sales. Well, it is if we have the wrong expectations or the wrong anticipation on the part of the person we're trying to sell or team we're trying to sell. Um,
It's why you need chief revenue officer thinking, even if you don't have a chief revenue officer, by title in an organization, because you've got to bring together your different, parts and specialities, sales and marketing, branding, and, financial piece, and be thinking holistically about, all of this from your perspective. But as you point out in your book, which is to me, it's a great insight, is what a lot of us get wrong is we're so focused on ourselves and our message and what we're going to get across instead of starting with the buyer, what you call buyer back. It's not, from our perspective, headquarters, which is where we are trying to get in the door, but it's like, what do they care about? What is the buyer trying to accomplish? And I love your tie into Simon Sinek. You talk about start with why. When we're pitching, we're starting with what we bring to the table, what we're trying to sell, what it's going to do for you. And we come up with all sorts of these clever pitches. But if you ask about the purpose and what they're trying to do, if you start with their why and you can understand at what level do these, three, six, seven, whatever the number of people on the buying team, what do they all share in common that they care about? What is their common ground? What
Yep.
is the why that unites them, even though they have individual purposes and whys that are going to vary? It's going to be different, right? But it's like, what do they share in common? When you can have a meeting of minds there, that is a much better starting point. And I find that that's when you actually build trust.
Yeah.
That's when people start opening up and sharing things with you that they don't share with the guys showing up to pitch.
Right.
The buying team is sitting like this, arms crossed, kind of back in their chairs, a little bit skeptical and closed. I mean, the body language is telling you everything. It's like they're a little bit closed off. And if you ask a question, first of all, they're going to think, well, you didn't do your homework. But second of all, it's like, you haven't earned the trust, the right to
Yeah.
ask us that question. It's kind of like, and so you have these games that are played about the buying team expects you to be a mind reader and like, okay, well, show me what you got. Impress me. Literally had a VP do that. One of the people on my team had set the appointment, and I showed up and walked in the room with this VP, and he was like, "Tell me what you got." And this is in Shanghai, China, of all places, and I started pitching, and less than 10 minutes, he's like, I haven't heard anything that, interests me that's, that we don't already have. So thanks for coming. Appreciate it. And basically meeting over and no ability to salvage this. And so I was just shown the door politely and it was like, okay, that was over quickly. I obviously need to talk, and meet with my the sales development person and get a little bit, clearer about what we're trying to do to qualify people. But that is not the place you want to be to just show up and start pitching people and not have any trust built. And so I've learned a lot of my lessons through hard knocks and the hard way.
Well, it's interesting as I was listening to you, and this is a skill. I mean, learning how to listen to people is a skill. It's not something all of us start out with. But as I was
Right.
listening, one of the things that got really clear to me, and I talk about it, but I didn't feel it the way I felt it when I listened to your last comments, and that was if I pitch, I'm giving you my language, my examples, my reasons. If I can have a conversation where I learn what words you use, what stories you tell about this, and how your organization perceives this, my job should be to take your words and insert them in my stories so you don't have to learn what my language is. Because if your team has to learn my language for us to communicate, that's going to be much harder than to build that trust than if I take the time to understand what you define as value. And when you say things are really difficult, what does difficult look like? And, for me then to communicate to you in a way that is easy for you, it's low friction. And I think that's a really critical thing that when we see those really great senior salespeople or skilled salespeople, they do that. They don't make the buyer learn all the pitch of the seller. They let the seller communicate using the buyer's words.
I love that point, and you're right on the money. Um, I'm thinking about keeping this real world. Some people may be saying, well, that's great, Ron and Rick, if you can create trust and, have these situations, but that's not the reality where we are selling. And I'm thinking about right now, like, let's just talk about the military contracting world where, and not talking about sole source, we're talking about competitive bid, where all the information is supposed to be shared. If you have questions to the buyer, that is going to get roped into into a document that is shared with everyone. Everyone should have access to the same set of information, before you make your presentation, your pitch, right? Well, yes, you need to get your information in advance and you need to build some relationship if at all possible and try to understand the language of the buying team and the decision makers who cares about this so that when you actually do quote pitch, it's like you call it, it's not about pitching blind or into the void. It really is walking people through a preview of what it's like to work with you and what the world is going to look like implementing the solution you're proposing.
Yeah.
And if you're speaking their language and you've really done your homework well, then it's not going to sound so different or alien and have so many questions about how is this going to work? How's that going to work? And you actually create trust by knowing the situation well enough and knowing the buyer's language and the organization and where the bodies lie and what failed. They've already tried this 3 times, right? And they tried to implement and it didn't work those 3 times. And there's a lot of stories, behind that. You don't have to recount all of those, but if you know enough about it,
Yeah.
you know what the dead ends are. And so even in a very competitive bid process like military contracting or, dealing with a buying team where you would think that's on the right side of Bell Curve 2.0, where it's very competitive and they're going to get, try to beat you down to the lowest price. Not completely. Even like in military contracting, there's, they can the best technical solution for the lowest price. It still has to, tick the box of it actually does satisfy the requirements, on a technical level. And if you've done your homework, you know how to fit in the niche that none of your competitors can because none of your competitors are you
Yeah.
unless you have actually tried to um, you know, fit into your industry and you look the same as ABC.
You know,
But that's not smart. That's not smart, Rev.
yeah. It's again, as you were telling that story and talking about doing the homework, and I'm amazed how seldom, and it doesn't matter if it's sales or marketing or product development, people actually go out and read websites, look at people's individual LinkedIn profiles, look at public information and,
Right.
and read blogs and, published by this company. And if you do that, you know those stories, you know those words, you know which people should be part of this equation. And I'm just astounded at how seldom anybody does it. And if they do it, they don't apply the learning to the communication.
In the intelligence community, they call that open source, intelligence. It's out there for everyone. You just have to go look for it. You gotta comb, the sources, and they're out in plain sight. It's not like you have to, penetrate an organization and get some sort of special knowledge that's, off limits to everyone else. So yes, for sure you've got to do your homework. You've got to get in there. And we really haven't talked too much about the emotions, but this is one of the things that I found was a differentiator was first of all, learning that I myself am not very aware. I'm not self-aware. And that my Aikido analogy pointed that out. But I mean, um, learning to tune into my own emotions and knowing, okay, there's a natural sort of nervousness or, the jitters or whatever, but it shouldn't be because I didn't do my homework. It shouldn't be because I haven't talked to everyone possible in advance and gotten a good feel for where we are and what needs to happen here. So all of those things that are going to make us nervous or give us the jitters due to lack of preparation, it's like that's on me. I need to own that. So there's the self-awareness piece, but then learning to be not so self-conscious and tune into my buyers and realize that the more I pitch, the more I'm going to deal with a predictable set of emotions. People are going to be cynical.
Yeah.
They're going to be kind of, have a high bar and be judgmental. They might be a little bit afraid
Yeah.
of like, letting their guard down. Uh, Often there's a career.
Oh, yeah.
there's a career implication of making a large, purchase. And people, I've often heard people in corporate use this language. That would be a career limiting move, to make a bad purchase decision. And so there's a lot at stake for them, especially if I'm pitching, if I start with what, which is one reason why I've figured out that going in at the beginning and starting with why, I really want to tap a whole different set of emotions. I want people to have curiosity, and
Yes.
I want to appeal to things that have them leaning forward with anticipation, like, well, maybe this guy actually has something that might work, or it has
Yeah,
something
yeah, yeah,
different
yeah,
that we weren't expecting. And and it's a good surprise. It's that, to me, that's the difference, of anticipation and surprise. Surprise is often bad. It's bad.
yeah.
It's not a good thing, right? But anticipation is like, I'm expecting positive things to come out of this. And I want to really tune into that, not just body language, but also, have my buyers coming from a whole different place that's more resourceful and that is not in the familiar ruts. Because the typical buying team is like kind of like impress me, you know, uh, like I said, arms folded and kind of closed off. And if you let that intimidate you, if you aren't, prepared to come in and show them, I've done my homework and I have tried to understand you, but I'm not just a cocky person who's got it all figured
Yeah.
out. Like, help me here. Help me to do the best job possible for you. And here's what I've done, to get to this place. Now show me where we're off. And then you start partnering with them and you get a whole different emotional response than the typical buying situation.
The other thing, as you were going through some of the emotions that are there early between the seller and the buyer, my experience with the team on the buying side is, and I've heard this told to me by the teams many, many, many times, is we as a buying team, the six of us or five of us or eight of us or whatever it is, we have never been in the same room at the same time before today. And, so now you have the cross silo conflicts that are natural in the buying organization because they're all competing for headcount and budget and accolades and, all kinds of stuff. So not
Right.
only do we have to create the trust between the seller and the buyer organizations, but we got to get the buyers to trust each other in this particular situation. And, so that's all of those emotions now going across the buying organization as well as between the two organizations. So, there's some really fascinating stuff going on, just to be learning about people and the environment.
One of the things I really appreciate about Smart Rev is you've taken so many different uh, models and learning from through the decades, really, and brought them together into one place, into a coherent approach, a model, and that's some of the thing that I've brought into my own selling is, we talk about emotions. Well, emotions are hard to pin down. Emotions are hard to really understand. And, this goes back about 4 years. I went out myself as the pandemic hit. I was doing quite a bit of work on emotional intelligence, and I was saying, how do we name some of these, feelings or emotions? How do we bring some order to it? And I found there's a lot of different emotion wheels on the market, but they didn't really kind of make sense to me. They didn't seem to have an underpinning. Just like you, revenue science, there's a science under this. It's not just
Yeah,
thrown together or cobbled out of, a lot of disparate pieces. And so, I came up with my own emotions wheel. I've got one up on the wall here,
yeah,
that I use. And I've actually found that there's a way that it's laid out that helps me. It's like a compass,
yeah.
keep it straight. I mean, you talk about your true north in revenue science. Within the emotions wheel, there are predictable patterns to these, and they actually correspond to biology.
Yeah.
That whenever people are angry, they tend to make themselves bigger and occupy more
Yeah.
space, lean forward, they get more aggressive. When people are scared, they make themselves small and they kind of
Yeah.
try to hide. And that goes back to you say hunter-gatherer days. Whenever you're afraid, you want to hide from the predator, right? And but these things I found, like psychologists who've researched it, there's a logical sort of layout and a patterning to emotions. You can learn that and you
Yeah.
can use it so that if you find yourself lost in the woods, if you find yourself lost in, this is really old language, but deep carpet, right? If you're selling in the C-suite and you find yourself lost in the conversation, how do you get yourself, found again or located? How do you, right the ship? And to me, it helps to think about the emotions. Okay, let's go back to why. Why are we doing this? And how do we tap people back into that resourceful place of curiosity, of hope that, okay, we're actually trying to solve big problems that we care about that would make a big impact on this organization. If we can get people focused on those places, it's a much better place to be, working together in partnership than nickel and diming and looking at, can you lower it, 10 cents? Can you get the margins, down in the right place? And it's like, okay, we're not in the right frame of mind to actually be dealing with a solution here.
Yeah. And they being the buying team, will self-police themselves if we stay at the why level.
That's right.
Which, we don't have to self-police them. First, it's not our job.
Right.
But more importantly, when they focus on something important, they will interpret from their own silos, but they're interpreting for the organization to get better. And so it's just fun to watch the joy that they get out of doing something collaboratively, which frequently they don't get to do that. So,
That's a great, call out of, like you said, the buying team doesn't always get together. And, a lot of organizations, large organizations especially, part of the cost of chaos that we were talking about earlier is that they're not talking to one another. They are operating in silos. And therefore, systems aren't optimized, people aren't optimized. We don't have the right fit. And you know, frankly, buying teams aren't always optimized, but you've got to deal with the people that you've got, in front of you
yep,
so that you have the opportunity to influence it, for the future. So, there's a lot of, different parts here, but I enjoy Smart Rev. And one of the things that I did, I'll give this as a tip to any of your viewers or the listeners to the podcast. I gave a copy of the book to my son who's 20 years. I have two sons. My younger son is 20 years old. I gave a copy to him and said, read this and then give me a book report. I paid him for it, but it's like, read this and give me a book report. I had already read the book and he did. And I was amazed at some of the things. I asked for 3 points, three solid points. In order to get paid, he had to, come up with things. Well, he surprised me. He gave me 5 points. And you know what? His fifth point was, what is your cost of chaos? And he actually went into this and really dissected it. He got kind of excited about it. I was like, man, that was good. And his point four, again, I only asked for three, but it was like, build a revenue focused mindset first and foremost. And he went into, like three sub points underneath that. So I really enjoyed seeing how someone of a different generation and the younger generation really took hold of your concepts and keyed in on different things. He's in touch with different parts of the culture than I am. And I would encourage people listening to this, get someone in your organization or get someone in your family, someone in your network, but of a different organization and from a whole different mindset, different, starting point to read the book and then have a dialogue with them about it. It it will give you additional and valuable insights.
wow, cool story. So we're running out of time. So, Ron, what's the one thing you'd like to leave us with about, the the concepts of, I'd love it if you tie together uh, the power of um, empathy around people's emotions and who they are and where they're going with the Smart Rev work in any way that you feel comfortable.
There is so much more possible if you will um, not just look in the predictable places, but if you look for the why, your own personal why, but also your buyers, why they care and what they care about, and start with that and pay attention to where the emotions are pointing you. They give indicators. Whenever people are stressed, anxious, or a little cynical and,
Mhm.
judging, they're doing it for a reason. It tells you that you're in the old familiar places where there's very little hope and where chaos is reigning. But when you get people to the more resourceful place where possibility is and that people are hopeful and they're curious, then you can start doing things that haven't been done before, that break out of the mold and can actually produce a solution or a result that is unprecedented, that actually escapes that, the bounds of chaos.
Wow. Well, Ron, I want to thank you. This has been fun, and I think there is so much good content in here. I think some people are going to listen to it two or three times. So
Awesome. I hope so.
thank you for being here.
Thank you, Rick.
For the rest of you, I want to thank you all for being here as well. And if you'll see Ron's contact information is there on the screen. Please reach out, and he'll be glad to bring some of his knowledge to your organization or to you personally. And for all of you, I hope we see you at the next one in another 2 weeks. Thank you.